Welcome everyone to Ladder Daily Digest. We honor creators, and we did a show about Daniel Hartman Rector a week ago, and we were unable to get Lisa, his wife, on the show at the time. She was busy, and we thought we'd give her a chance to come on the show and explain some things. And also Maxine Hanks has offered up some comments that we thought would be good to bring her on the show to talk about her experience. And so welcome Maxine and Lisa to the show.
Yay. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Lila is co-hosting with me today, and Lila is Daniel's sister. Just younger?
5 years.
5 years younger sister. And I'm just a nobody. Thanks everybody for coming on the show. And we're turning the time over to Lisa to talk about some of the errors in facts. So we're in the modern age of fact checking. We wanted Lisa offered to clarify some of the information.
No, overall, I think you guys did a great job. I got really confused when I was listening because I'm like, wait a minute. Daniel didn't get his temple recommend taken away during the September 6th era. He had left Sunstone at that point. He left in 1991. But what happened to Lex and Albert, in 1990, the church had changed the temple ceremony. And Albert wrote a piece. It was very brief, very short piece that they put in Sunstone that was reporting on the stories that had been reported in other newspapers about those changes. So they didn't really go into detail. They just said, these are the stories and these are the changes that were reported. After that happened, both Albert and Daniel were called in by their stake presidents, and they were both reprimanded, and their recommends were taken. That happened. So I actually called Albert to ask him, do I have this right? What's your memory? He thought it was 1990. I think it might have been 1991, but somewhere in that time frame. So that's kind of how that went. And then the other correction might be Albert's memory was like Lila, like he wanted to get it back. I know I wasn't that interested in getting mine back. Not that mine was taken, but there's the guilty by association thing. So I'm not sure I even had one at the time. I was going to church, but I don't remember that I was going to the temple. But Daniel, whether he got his back, I know there was a point where Daniel said, I just really don't want to keep renewing it because I don't want anyone to have the power to take something like that from me. So the other thing I just wanted to say is I don't think that it was about like the church was protecting Daniel because he was, a general authority's son, as much as they wanted to make it very clear to them, send a message to them that they couldn't do these things. And they were trying to slowly close Sunstone down. So when Daniel and Albert were a great team, they worked really well together, and things were just going gangbusters until 1991 when this happened. And then right after that, the church also issued a statement on symposia that Maxine may be able to talk about a little bit, if you remember that, Maxine. And I think that was when, it was kind of like no BYU professors, no good church members should attend. This is not an okay thing to do. And so before that, and maybe even right around that time, Daniel and Albert were trying to get the brethren to attend the symposia. They were very young, ambitious.
Energetic.
Ambitious isn't the right word, but they were very idealistic. And they both had a lot of energy, and they really believed in the Sunstone cause. And so they're like, yeah, we'll get, if we can get these guys to come. And Albert had this idea, because I just talked to him a couple days ago about this, that if we, talk to Gordon Hinckley, maybe he'd be willing. And that was a complete disaster. They got a message from who was the guy? I wrote down his name. Anyway, it was somebody who said something like, don't ever do that again. Bad idea. This isn't happening. And then when Daniel, he did leave in 1991, and I was talking to Albert about that. Why do you recall that he left? And Albert said, well, Daniel told me it was mostly financial because we had 4 kids at this time, and it was really difficult. But I also think that, he was just getting worn down by the whole thing. Daniel enjoyed and loved the mountains. He loved skiing, backcountry skiing. He loved hiking. He loved biking. He was devoting more time to those pursuits and friends, things like that were really mattered to him more than he loved the gospel. I think Paul Toscano was spot on in everything he said. Because when you were asking Lila about, I wish I could talk to Daniel about, how he felt when this happened and if he felt remorse. I don't think he felt remorse. Daniel was not a person who was shamed or guilted. He would change his position. He was really good at he had a huge amount of empathy. And so he could shift and start to see things from another perspective. And so, for example, if I was struggling with the kids and I had too much on my plate, if I said to him, hey, I don't think this is fair, because there was so much, he had been raised in a home where it was very patriarchal. That was his modeling, but when I started to tell him, hey, this isn't working well for me, he just shifted and he started carrying a lot more of the load with the kids. He was so wonderful that way.
That's right. I was wondering if we can go now to Maxine and have her talk about some of the dates and the context that she mentioned, or do you have another thing to say?
I wanted to kind of finish, that thought about, no, I've actually forgotten the thought. Now it's gone. So go ahead and shift.
Sorry about that.
If you remember, raise your hand.
I'll raise my hand.
Yeah. Gosh, I want to hear as much as Lisa can remember. Gosh, it's been so long.
Yeah, we'll go back and forth and we'll chat some more.
So I thought I'd give a little bit of background and a little bit of context. I met Daniel in January of 1986, right after he came on. He came on with Sunstone, I think, very end of 85, very beginning of 86 as the publisher. He was the publisher and the money guy, the finance guy, and they were looking for an editor. And Daniel and Gary approached me in February to see if I would be editor of Sunstone magazine. The 3 of us at that same time in February 1986, we went on KSL Talk About, was a TV talk show with Shelley Osterloh. And we went on that show together to give support to Linda Newell. She was being interviewed by Shelley Osterloh about her book, Mormon Enigma, Emma Smith, Mormon Enigma. And so we went on the TV show, and the 3 of us, I really want to find that old tape somewhere because it's really a great snapshot of the past with Daniel Rector and Gary Bergera and I on that show together to support Linda Newell at a time when the church was coming down on her, telling her and Val that they couldn't speak about the book anywhere. And so she came on the talk show to talk about what she was going through. And at that time, Daniel had just joined Sunstone and they were looking for an editor. And I was just leaving BYU. Mike Quinn and I both left BYU in 85. And so I was just leaving BYU in December of 85 and planning to move to Salt Lake and go to the U of U. So it was a really interesting time. And I actually declined the offer to be editor because I was planning to go back to school and transfer to the U of U, which I did that summer. Anyway, just a little context about the time. Well, and the reason why they approached me about being editor was because, back a little bit, Scott Kenny and Alan Roberts and Peggy Fletcher Stack founded Sunstone in 1974. The 3 of them, and they worked on it together. And then Scott Kinney moved on and founded Signature Books in 1981. And Alan Roberts went over and worked with Wally Cooper to make Cooper Roberts Architects. That was like end of the 70s. I think it was like 79. Anyway, Peggy stayed at Sunstone until 85. And then she got married and was going to leave and be a traveling journalist with her husband, Mike Stack. So she left Sunstone in 85, and Ron Bitton was filling in for her. They were between editors before they found a new editor. So I was working at BYU, but I was coming up to Salt Lake and helping Ron Bitton with Sunstone and writing some stories and things. So that's why Daniel and Gary approached me as soon as Daniel came on. Anyway, that's just kind of the time context of what was going on. Yeah. Everything converged in that summer of 1986. It was really an interesting time. Again, before I go into a little more context, it was such an intense time, in Mormon studies, because Daniel dared to enter into Mormon studies and take a major role at the major dissenting organization in Mormon studies 2 months after the Hartman bombings in October of 1985. The 1980s were a very conflicted time and a very intense time in Mormon studies, because the 70s had brought the new history, the new Mormon history. So there was a lot of tension between new histories and new research on Mormonism versus the traditional view, the traditional story. This is all exploding between 1981 and 89 in the 80s. And in the middle of that, there are a lot of tensions there between new views, new research, new history versus the old, and between church leaders and scholars, historians, feminists. Mike Quinn was getting on the bad side of church leaders at that time for the work that he was publishing. And then Hartman sets off his bombs in October of 85, which made everything 10 times worse. It was a very scary time. It was literally the aftermath of the Hartman bombings. It was also the aftermath of the Sonia Johnson excommunication in 79. So feminism was a scary thing. Nobody wanted to use the word feminism. I had a really hard time getting anybody to let me use that word in my work. It was just a very conflicted time and a difficult time. And also another tension was just the privilege versus the new voices. We had a lot of new, young, amateur and student scholars versus the old guard, the PhDs. And there was a kind of a question as to whether any of us younger people without PhDs could really do scholarship or not. Anyway, Daniel Rector walks into the middle of all of this at the end of 1985 with his energy, positive energy, his vision, his optimism. He had a deep, deep hunger to find deeper answers, better answers than what we'd had before. And he was a bridge builder. He wanted to bridge between church leaders and scholars, and between Orthodox and unorthodox, and traditionalists and critics, and men and women. I mean, he was totally inclusive. He was a breath of fresh air, because the 80s was still a very sexist time in Mormon culture and in Mormon studies. It was very male-centric. And I was a feminist wanting to do feminist work, and it was really difficult because feminism was feared in the aftermath of the Sonia Johnson excommunication. So it was really hard time all the way around. The 80s were a dark decade and a very difficult decade. And Daniel came in like this breath of fresh air. He had a self-confidence, and he had a hunger and a humility. He was open to learn, and he was really devoted to not only being inclusive, including everybody at Sunstone, men and women, traditionalists and critics, old guard and new researchers. But he really wanted to help us understand each other better. He wanted to bridge between perspectives, between all of those perspectives, and find paradoxical answers that could really answer both. And he was really ahead of his time.
Yeah. It's almost like interfaith work within the Mormon culture.
Yeah, well, he was doing inclusion. He was practicing inclusion and dialoguing between perspectives and bridging and peacemaking. He just really he really was a mediating influence between all views and all sides, honestly, during the hardest decade, right smack in the middle of the hardest decade that I can remember since the 70s in Mormon culture and Mormon studies. It was a dark and a difficult time. And he came in with this ideal of getting us all together at Sunstone and getting leaders to talk to scholars and men and women and feminists and non-feminists and new scholars and old scholars. And he was really trying to heal the polarization. But also, one big thing I really remember Daniel talking about a lot was the dilemma of objectivity. He was challenging this idea that historians were still hanging on to, even after the new cultural turn of the 70s, which became the cultural turn of the 70s in history and humanities and social science, was to be more inclusive, to uncover all the missing stories and be inclusive. But it was still aiming for objectivity. And Daniel came in and said, I just don't see how anyone can claim to be truly objective. We all have our biases, and our biases frame our perspective. And he said, objectivity is a fine goal to shoot for, as long as you're willing to admit how much your biases are still shaping you. And he was calling for that sort of confessing your subjectivity from both sides, from apologists, conservatives, and critics. And I just remember that was a really big deal for him. And I have to say he was ahead of his time on that too, because that idea of confessing your subjectivity and being transparent and confessing your standpoint, that was an idea that came in more really into academia in the early 90s with feminism and feminist studies. But it was an ideal. He had these ideals, and Dan was right. History and time has proved Daniel Rector right. He was just a couple of decades ahead of his time. He came in at a time when we needed him. We all needed him. He was so good to me as a working class feminist when trying to enter a field that was very privileged and male-centric and hostile to feminism. He was good to all of us, and he was good to Mormonism, and he was good to leaders, and he was good to critics, and he was so far ahead of his time. He was needed, but he was too early. He came in at the worst possible time. It was the wrong timing for his vision, but he was right. And time has proved him right.
He was perfectly situated in a way because of being the son of a general authority and having an interest in history via his and theology via his discussions with Paul Toscano, and like you say, young, fresh, excited, ready to take on the world's problems, and he saw the world's problems. He probably saw his mom being mistreated a little bit by patriarchy. Do you think that's why he could turn so fast for you, Lisa?
No, I don't think he saw his mom being taken advantage of necessarily. I think, he just resonated if his mom had said she was, but his mom was very much in line with all of that and supportive of everything. So I don't think he felt that way. But, if someone would say, hey, here's my experience, he totally was right there, empathic listener. He was a facilitator, So I think, everything Maxine said was right. I think that Daniel, he just liked to bring people together. And I think he thought that people would be able to work things out and get along. And it just, it was a very difficult time. She's right. It was a dark time in the church to me. Right. And just the way it's the authoritarian nature of the structure that made it so difficult. It was they were so dogmatic and so, not wanting to share that power and have it be a top down. So a lot of people were in line with that, and that they didn't see, a different way of doing things that Daniel saw. He had a lot of vision, and like Maxine said, he probably was ahead of his time.
One thing we missed from our other part was your meeting Daniel for the first time in the courtship and stuff like that. You want to say anything about that?
Yeah, actually, there's a lot to say about that. It was a really fun time. I had been on a study abroad to Israel with BYU, and I came home from that, and it was like an amazing experience. Going to the Holy Land, and I was 19, and we were there 6 months, and I came home, and I went.
You walked where Jesus walked.
Yes, and everything was very positive for me, about the church. And I came home, and there were there were probably 6 of us girls that decided, hey, we're going to go on missions. Because we were really treated pretty well as women at that time. So just because we were students, we're all students, and it was just fun. We went all over. We went to Egypt. We went to Jordan. We went to, the Sea of Galilee. We went to Greece and Egypt and just all over. So I came home after having been on this wonderful experience and deciding I'm going to go on a mission. So I'm down at BYU, and I was sitting on the lawn with my missionary discussions, memorizing my missionary discussions. And Daniel kind of recognized me, said he saw my blonde hair, looked over, and then he recognized me. And so he came over to talk to me, and he asked me out. We went out. I think we went to a concert or something. And then the next, probably we maybe went on a few other dates, but the next thing I remember that was big is we went. This is what I really liked about Daniel, is he was an adventurer. And I love adventuring. I've always loved hiking and skiing, and I've always done crazy adventuring myself. So he invited me to go on a little hiking. It was an overnight hiking thing, and it was the middle of winter. And we hiked up somewhere behind Aspen Grove area with a friend of his, and we dug a snow cave. So this is his friend Stan Ricks, and Stan brought a date. We dug a snow cave. We slept in this. We cooked over an open fire. We dug this snow cave. It was freezing, and I remember Stan's date got really sick, and she just wasn't doing well. And I just remember, it was kind of like, wow, okay, I was enjoying it because I like that stuff. So we slept in the snow cave, and the next morning we got up early and we skied on our cross skis up. Way up high. We came to this giant meadow that was kind of risk of avalanche. And I remember we had to cross one by one because we were kind of afraid, but that was my introduction to Daniel. And then we drove down in his Bronco. So, I already knew this about him because I knew him at East. And like Lila said, he was just this cool guy, and he knew who I was before that, but that was the beginning. And then I learned about his mission and his, he had so much energy and wanted to do something good. And at that time it was about, like trying to baptize a lot of people or help his dad in that whole baptize 1,000 idea. But then, like Paul said, he had an early experience when he was in junior high. I think he was about 13 or 14, probably young adult. And it was the Campus Crusade for Christ that came to Churchill Junior High, which is just down the hill from me. And they brought little pamphlets. And Daniel got this pamphlet, and it had, you confess Christ and you accept him as your Lord and Savior, whatever those little pamphlets say. And he was like, I do that. I accept Jesus and it's by grace, that you're saved. So Dan became a gracer, and he said he remembers them going, we got another one. And Daniel went home and told his mom and dad, or maybe just his mom, and they were like, okay, that's fine. That's good. Great. They didn't try to say, hey, no, we don't believe that. So that was his earliest experience with grace. He'd always, he'd never really thought about it that way, but he said that impacted him. But it kind of got lost. That grace concept kind of got lost until, Paul Toscano and another guy, Fred Boros, good friend of ours. And he started reading about it, and it really resonated with him. And he'd come home and we spent hours mulling over that, and it really changed him. All of a sudden, he's like, okay, I don't have to pay double, triple tithing. I don't have to be miserable. I can, I can accept Jesus. It's not about me. It's about, and he just changed his way of thinking. And that slowly just started. I think that was why he was, and he even said, like, early on, he started being nicer once he believed in grace. It kind of started to work in him and transform him into a nicer person because he believed this way. And I believe, Daniel, what I was going to say when you interrupted there, Eugene, was that, or it's Gene, I'm sorry, was that Daniel did not, I believe when Daniel died in 2002, he was, he was pained by the way the church was and the brethren. I don't think he ever had lost his hope and his belief in Jesus, so I think that he was he didn't need to go to church. It was a very personal belief he had. And I think the way Paul said that was correct. That he and Paul both kind of, neither of them were black and white thinkers. It's not like you're either in or you're out. To him, he could say, well, there might be other ways of thinking about this. There's all these crazy people. They do bad things. But that doesn't mean we throw the baby out with the bathwater. Does that, I don't know, Lila, when you hear that, does that kind of make sense to you?
Yeah. Before I answer that question, I can't see Maxine. Is Maxine on the screen right now?
So Maxine's phone overheated.
Oh, okay.
And
okay.
She's going to rejoin us soon.
There she is. Okay.
Sorry about that.
Computer going. That's good. Yeah, I mean, I don't know as deeply as you do, Lisa. You were right there living with him day in and day out. And I'm sure that you had more personal discussions with him about his belief. That Dan, the way I saw it, his faith and his belief was that he was deeply Christian and he loved, like you said, the whole idea of grace was central to that. And he didn't think that the church was focusing on that as much as they should be. And this is just my opinion of what he thought. I could be wrong. But it seems like that was what he was thinking is, let's focus more on the Jesus with grace philosophy and not so much on works and money and, working your way up the ladder and of leadership and all of that. That I think that all kind of was sour to him. And he was just more of like I told you, he would listen to these, not podcasts, they weren't podcasts back then, but they were radio channels of other faiths having their revival meetings or whatever, singing their gospel songs. And he loved that.
He did.
That was more in line with his, his belief system. And he,
right. So when everything went down, whenever Daniel stepped away from going to church, and that was a process, I think, where he was going on and off. But I think when all of that happened, he never lost his faith. He did lose his faith, I believe, in the church, in the hierarchy of the church, and their ability to be flexible and their ability to be empathic. I think he saw them more as, okay, they've got to protect, they're trying to protect the church, the members. However he saw that, maybe he didn't agree with them, but that's kind of where he was. I don't know how he would have progressed, whether he would be more agnostic. I think Daniel had a strong belief in some kind of goodness after this life and that there was more. And that was just part of, he'd been raised in the church. So you don't just go from being a full believer to walking away overnight. It's a process for people if they're going to leave. And so that, you know, he did find a lot of solace in the mountains and in hiking, but he was always a happy person. He just had a very positive temperament, which he may have gotten from his dad. I mean, that was Hartman Rector Jr. was a very happy, positive person. And Daniel was like that. He would come home and he'd say, aren't you happy? You know, and he'd sing, and, you know, he was just very, very positive. So that was a wonderful thing about Daniel. He was easy to be with, and easy to be with because he was such a kind and positive person. Yeah.
A lovely person to be around.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I always experienced Daniel. And again, he was unusual. He wasn't the typical liberal or critic, and he wasn't coming from a male-centric or sexist point of view. He was just this regular guy who leaped into Mormon Studies and just brought in this wonderful positive energy and openness and humility. He didn't bring the baggage in with him that a lot of us had. We all had some kind of baggage, you know, and he just didn't seem to have any baggage, you know?
Yeah.
And whenever I would say, Daniel, it's so nice to see you, and he'd always smile and he'd say, well, it's always nice to be seen.
That's funny.
He was funny.
Well, he wasn't treated very nicely by some of them. I will say, Packer, number one, was probably, I'm guessing, the worst one. I don't know who else he interacted with regularly, but Packer was rough on Dan. And he was rough on my dad. He was rough on both of them.
Daniel was in a bit of a power struggle with his dad, and that is I mean, that's not just because of church issues. I think that, you know, his dad had that model of kind of, you know, patriarchy, and Daniel was his own
military too.
And one of my earliest memories was Daniel had asked this when Daniel was Elders Quorum president. He asked his dad, because this young man in our Elders Quorum said, hey, could you get your dad to come and talk to my wife? She's going to leave me because she can't deal with, I think she was having issues, as I recall, because I remember talking to her with the feminist thing and with, you know, being in a one down position. And so Dan's like, sure, I'll see if Dad will come talk to her or him. I can't remember if it's her or him. But when Hartman came to the door, I answered the door, and he said, hey, I'm here, you know, I'm here to talk. And I said, hey, by the way, innocently, I said this. I didn't know him early. I said, oh, okay, but don't tell her what to do. I said something, it was, in my thinking, pretty benign thing. That did not go well. And my father-in-law was like, don't tell me what to do. He got sharp at me and put me right in my place.
Put you right in your place. I know. I had it happen to me a whole bunch of times.
And Daniel, I told Daniel about it. I said, wow, you know, and he called up his dad and he said, I need you to apologize to Lisa. That's not okay. And, you know, he did it. My father apologized to me. Yes, he did.
What?
Yes.
You got the only apology.
Probably not the only one. I think Hartman was in a very hard place because, you know, he was trying to navigate this.
Yeah.
I remember him saying at one point, okay, Daniel, the brethren, you know, they were coming after him and telling, can't you control your son?
Yep.
And Hartman said to them, he's his own person. No, I cannot, you know, like, no, I'm not him. We're not like, you know, one. And so that was kind of how that went. But it was that conflict between Hartman was, you know, he just believed in that authority system, I think. And he was trying to make it work and navigate it. And he was in a hard place. So, you know, I think that's just kind of the way it goes. If you have that belief in the authoritarian kind of top down, you get the narcissism of what I call a narcissistic organization, where, you know, it's not about you, the people, the little people. It's more about, you know, what leaders are saying.
Well, also, I have to jump in there and bring up a skeleton in Hartman's closet, because I think he was evolving. I think Dan was helping him to evolve out of a much more traditionalist, sexist position. A lot of those men in the 60s and 70s didn't realize how sexist they were. But Hartman went down in feminist history as the author of the Black Widow metaphor.
Oh, yes.
Remember that? Mormons for ERA with Sonia Johnson.
Do you remember that, Lila?
I don't think so. Please tell me.
Do you remember the Black Widow? Yeah. So, and feel free to jump in and add if I'm, because it's been a long time since I looked at it. But when I was researching the Mormons for ERA newsletters and archive up at the U to put in Women in Authority, I excerpted a material from all of the Mormons for ERA newsletters. Anyway, it was around the middle of that, around 79. I think it was I think it was before Sonia was excommunicated. Hartman had made this statement comparing feminists to Black widows, that if, I wish I could remember it verbatim. It's in my book, in the Mormons for ERA section of the reprints chapter. But he's criticizing women who are trying, feminists who are trying too hard to assert themselves, and he compared them to Black widows, that they would surely eat and overpower their husbands and eat and consume them like a Black widow. Do you
Almost
remember?
Like a slippery slope.
Yeah,
right?
Probably a bad analogy. Yeah.
Yeah, and so he became famous among feminists as the author of the Black Widow metaphor for feminists.
Terrible. That's terrible.
So, you can read it. It's in my book. But so he was evolving from that time onward, and I observed that. I remember mentioning that to Dan, teasing Daniel about it, about the Black Widow analogy. But he was learning, because a lot of those men, hadn't learned. It was like this slow education process of 70s. And I always said that Utah culture was 20 years behind American culture. So the 80s in Utah were like the 60s in American culture. I mean, think the TV show Mad Men,
Yeah, I was just going to say that.
That was the 80s.
Yeah.
It was bad.
In the church.
And not just in the church. Utah culture, even liberal progressive Mormonism, was like Mad Men. It was bad. And Daniel comes into this, again, not with that baggage. He wasn't sexist.
No, he wasn't. And I don't know how. Well, I do attribute it to his transformation into grace, because the reason I do that is, well, that and his huge amount of empathy that he had. Because what was modeled for Daniel in his home was not necessarily, it was very patriarchal. So he hadn't had it modeled. There was an early time in our relationship where I remember before we were married, and I was pretty upset about it, to the point where I thought, maybe this isn't going to work out. He made some comment about, maybe, you're supposed to be supporting me, when I was kind of pushing back on something he said. I don't even remember what it was, but he said, how come you're not just supporting what I say? You're supposed to support me. And I'm like, I am? I didn't know that. I didn't grow up in the Mormon church.
No.
So even though
interesting,
the greater culture also has this theme, but it wasn't as, it wasn't as much.
No.
So I was like, what do you mean? I'm not supposed to, I'm supposed to just support you? No, I don't think so. We're kind of, I don't believe that.
You're an individual.
So his empathy is what allowed him to shift on that, I think. And over time, he became incredibly. I'm going
to credit you more than you're doing, because I think you had a really huge effect on Dan, because you weren't raised Mormon. So you pushed back on some of those things where he had to stop and think, wait a minute, maybe this isn't okay. Maybe what I've been doing isn't right, because my wife, who I adore, is telling me, no, that's not okay. I think you pushed back on the whole polygamy thing. And got him to think.
Yeah, what I used to call the glory days of polygamy, because they would have these people over. Dan would talk to Andy Ehad, and he had people, and they were talking about it, and as if dang, wish we had those times. I'm not saying Daniel was doing this, but you know, they just talked about it. And I'm like, okay, this was a dark period to me. Like, okay, if you're going to do polygamy, let's at least be fair about it.
There was talk in my ward, you know, we had some, you know, older men in elders quorum that hadn't advanced in leadership. And so they stayed elders. They weren't made high priest. And they would talk about how, you know, they might have been 20 or 30 years older than most of the elders, about how the second coming can't happen until all things are restored. So polygamy has to come back.
I've heard that before.
Yeah.
Right.
There are some old guys who still think that. Sorry, what's that, Lisa? I didn't hear.
Isn't that convenient? Yeah, I just think those are.
I think it's already been restored, and that was enough. Thank you. I've
run into bishops even now who still, once in a while, I've run into one bishop who thought that, and I corrected him. When was that, Lisa, that you were, what years would you say that was when you were kind of helping Daniel to be a bit more sensitive and like he was talking about, was that in the 80s or late 80s?
Yeah, we got married in 1980. And so that happened before we got married. And I remember we were just kind of like in this little thing. We'd never had anything like that happen. But I remember going up to his house to talk to him, and his mom answered the door and she says, "Don't you hurt my Daniel." I'm like,
she did?
Okay. I remember thinking, well, actually, it was kind of the other way around. But, you know, we worked it out and we ended up, you know, getting married, of course. And, you know, he really was so capable of getting it. More than anybody I know or have ever known.
Yeah, and that's it in a nutshell. The openness, the curiosity, the humility. That's what I remember about him, his openness and humility and empathy. And that's the key to getting it, because that's how the culture was. I mean, feminism was really just getting going in the 70s in the popular discourse with Ms. Magazine and everything. And so with Utah being so behind the times, in the 80s, I had double, triple duty. I was a feminist from childhood. And when I moved to Utah in 1980, I felt like I had to educate not only conservative church people, but fellow intellectuals and liberals, men in the culture, and even women, other women. People were so afraid of feminism in the 80s in Utah because of Sonia Johnson's excommunication. They were terrified of the word. I had to fight to use the word in my work. Other feminists and people did not want me to use the word feminism in the title of my book, which I was working on in the late 80s. And so, you know, young feminists today and, you know, younger people today, they have no idea how hard we had to work to educate our friends and our brothers and husbands and boyfriends to sensitivity to how disempowered women were in the larger culture, both Mormon and American culture. And I mean, I had to work very hard with my male friends in liberal Mormonism at Seventh East Press and Sunstone and Signature Books, and even Mike and I take credit for helping Mike Quinn to become more sensitive to feminist issues. He was very equality oriented. He really believed in equality for everybody and inclusion, but he was insensitive about sexism. And I really had to go the rounds with Mike, and I consider it an accomplishment that by the time we were done working on our article, he was fully converted to feminism, and he went off doing gender study projects. So we had to work hard, didn't we?
Oh, yeah.
Lila and Lisa.
Thank you for that.
You're right on that. Yeah.
So Maxine, how creative did you have to get to replace the word feminism? What other constructs did you come up with?
I didn't replace it. I adamantly included it, and I used the word feminist theology. My book is the first book in Mormon Studies to use the term feminist theology and apply it to Mormonism.
So you got pushback, but you pushed right back.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't back down one bit. Nope.
Okay. That's good. So I was thinking also, since we have Maxine here, you know, a lot of people, Sunstone is pretty much an institution now, you know, signature book institution, 17th Press. Someday somebody's going to know something about it. I'd like to do a show about all those things in the 70s that sort of spawned out of that sort of free new Mormon history kind of a thing, and different perspectives. And because there was even a movie in the 70s about an underground newspaper that had, I think, the actor Hurt in it and some other guys, and they were what?
William Hurt?
Yeah, I think William Hurt's in it, and some other young actors, and it's about a vibrant young underground newspaper trying to make it in their neighborhood. Try to break a story and try to become an acceptable thing to the area that they're doing it in. And so that reminds me of like Seventh East Press, and there was something else before that at BYU or concurrently. I don't remember.
No, after Seventh East Press, there was Student Review.
Yeah. And Dialogue was a little bit earlier.
Dialogue came in the late 60s. So Dialogue came along early in the late 60s. Yeah.
And that was Dallin Oaks, right?
Well, Gene England and Mary Bradford and all of those. Dallin wrote for Dialogue. People don't know this, but as an intellectual, which he is, and a scholar, he wrote for Dialogue. But then after he was called to be an apostle, he stopped writing for Dialogue. And I think Bruce Hafen used to be sympathetic too, and it seems like he had written for Dialogue, if I'm remembering right.
There was somewhat of a precedence for Daniel and Albert to approach these people, Gordon Hinckley and so forth.
Yeah.
That had been done earlier. Yeah.
There was, because the new scholarship of the 70s really gave rise to all this new work, that cultural turn in academia. But then, because it began emerging big time in the 80s, it began clashing in the 80s. The new scholarship and feminism.
The church had to tamp it down, control it.
Yeah, and so the clashes were happening in the 80s. And another context I'll mention really quickly that's interesting is that everything kind of converged that summer in 1986 when Daniel had just taken the helm at Sunstone as publisher. And then Albert came on in June, moved to Salt Lake and came on as editor. He was the editor they hired, and I was not meant to do it. I was meant to go into women's studies at the U of U, but Albert came on as editor and worked with Daniel, and they were a very powerful team. And then Mike Quinn also had left BYU, and so he was in Salt Lake. And right at that same time in June, when Albert comes on and he and Daniel are ready to take off, that's when the LDS Archives closed down access to LDS Archives in June of 86 and required that if you were going to use any material in LDS Archives to publish, you had to sign an agreement saying that you were going to let them review your work first. Well, a lot of people weren't willing to do that. And I think it was partly due to the aftermath of the Hoffman forgeries.
Oh, yeah.
But
and
also Mike.
The Tanners were releasing things too.
Yeah, the Tanners, but also the Hoffman, that rocked the church. I mean, that rocked all of us. It was terrifying. And then Mike's work, was challenging the traditional history. So all of those elements contributed to that. So that happened in June of 1986, right when Albert arrived and he and Daniel were ready to take off and do amazing idealistic things together, right? The church closes down the archives. So I was willing to sign that agreement because that's right when I started. I moved to Salt Lake and I had left BYU in January and moved to Salt Lake. And then I began researching at LDS Archives that same month. So I had to sign the agreement. I said, I don't care. I'm researching the Mormon Trail. I'll sign your agreement. So then Mike and everybody started coming to me and asking me to look up stuff for them at Archives, which is how they got around it. But this context of this convergence, the other thing I'll mention about it is that Daniel comes on and Albert shows up and Mike comes and we're all converging in Salt Lake right when things are really heating up. I mean, things explode and heat up with the Hoffman bombings and the forgeries, and we learned that they were forgeries. And so this tension between the church and new scholarship is just really colliding at that time and heating up, and then it will crescendo 7 years later in 93 with the September 6th. That's when it'll explode. Yeah. So poor Dan and Albert come in right at the time when things are heating up and heading towards this giant, climactic explosion in 1993. So,
right.
So that's
sort of the heat that started the simmering was Packer's talk about how some historians, value history so much. What does he say? I don't remember what he says.
Well, his talk in 1981, "The mantle is far, far greater than the intellect." Right. He gave that talk in September 1981. This is how the 80s start, with Packer's talk to scholars, historians at BYU. And he was basically saying that history should be faith promoting. We shouldn't be, focusing on the problems, And then Mike Quinn responded. Mike Quinn gave a talk right after that at BYU, countering Elder Packer's talk and saying that his view of history was one-sided, and you need both sides of history to have the whole story. And that launched this conflict between Elder Packer and Mike. So that had been brewing, resulting in Mike's forced departure from BYU. And I think it was 85. By the end of 85, he left. He saw the handwriting on the wall. He had to leave. And so, what begins in 81, and Seventh East Press began in 81. And then there was a mini purge in 1983 when a whole bunch of us lost our church jobs. And we call it the mini purge. And that was 83. And then Mike leaves BYU by the end of 85. And then 86, we all converge on Salt Lake. But what's interesting about that is that right at that moment, in the middle of this terrible decade, in 1986, a bunch of us all come to Salt Lake at the same time. And it became this great network where we would all go to the pub together. I took Ron and Gary to the pub after Martha Pierce's wedding, and that started the pub group. Because the pub at Trolley Square became this, place, where we could be free and talk, and those who wanted to drink beer could. And, we would all get together every Monday night for pub night. And then we would go out to clubs dancing and go to movies and restaurants. And there was this group, Ian Barber also came from New Zealand and was researching Mormon history at that time. So there was this amazing bohemian intellectual group of friends in Salt Lake, feminists and historians and scholars and new scholars trying to do work. And we all kept each other going. Especially Mike told me years later, he said, if you all hadn't, because he had just gone through the divorce. He left BYU and then he and Jan divorced. So he was without a job and without a marriage, alone, trying to figure out what to do as a gay man in single life for the first time. And we just took him in and embraced him. Daniel and Mike were really good friends. Daniel was so wonderful to Mike. And Mike told me years later that if we all hadn't provided that place for him, if we hadn't taken him in and shown him how to be single in Salt Lake and created this wonderful subculture of free-spirited bohemian Mormon scholars, he said he would have taken his own life at that time.
I did not know they were close. I didn't know. Yeah.
They were. Daniel was so good to Michael. Michael adored Daniel, just adored him. Because Michael and Daniel were alike. They were a lot alike in that they were both completely open-minded. They were both completely open to whatever the history or the information or the sources or the truth is going to tell you, and then just deal with it and make the best of it. And yet they both loved the church. They loved Mormon heritage, and they wanted to hold on to all the good parts, all the plain and precious and inspired parts of Mormon theology and history and culture. So they shared that in common. And again, it was unusual. And Mike also was very, very inclusive, very welcoming, very supportive. He was wonderful to me. Without Mike, I wouldn't be who I am. He mentored me and took me under his wing. And especially since he wanted me to help him do research, I got to learn from him. But Michael and Daniel had a lot in common. And I would look at them both as these powerhouse men who really brought positive energy and constructive balance and paradoxical balance to Mormon studies at the darkest time. I mean, the darkest time was October 85. And then here comes, Daniel and Michael and all of us working together. And they really, they really just brought this ability to deal with things. And not everybody could do that. It was rare. Most people were kind of polarized. People were either focused on criticism and pointing out what's wrong, and focusing, doing the shadow work, or they were trying to defend it, and not that many people were in the paradoxical middle. And Mike and Daniel both were.
You can see that.
John DeLynn of Mormon Stories podcast talks about, standing on the shoulders of giants. And so, lots of people stand on Von Brodie's shoulders, right, in the New Mormon history. And then all the stuff that's happening with the 17th Press and Signature Book and Sunstone is happening. And, it all happened somehow, right? Maybe at the pub in a napkin or in the back of an envelope, somebody starts tracing out what could be done for Sunstone or how to do a Mormon, publishing house and stuff like that. Everything starts somewhere, right? And someday that would be a great history sort of lesson. But you and we're working with Daniel at Sunstone in 1986.
No, I was helping Ron.
On?
I was helping Ron Bitton in 1985, but between Peggy and then Daniel and Elbert coming on. But yeah, so 85 and then 86, I was helping Ron Bitton and then Daniel. I was writing a couple of stories and helping at the office and doing some things. I was in that interim period before I went back to school in June, and Elbert came in June, and so.
Right, and then most of your interaction with Sunstone would be publishing some of your writings, right?
Yeah, well, speaking at the symposia. Speaking
right?
at the symposia. But what you said is so true, Gene, because people have no idea how many innovations, ideas, and projects came out of, supper at pub or after or one evening when we were at dinner or whatever, or
bunch of people talking.
Some of the arguments, like we would all argue about stuff, and we had amazing arguments. And out of those arguments, things emerged. My book project and Mormon Alliance came out of a discussion that Paul Toscano and Ron and I were having over at Signature Books. I mean, there are just all these moments when something was born, and it is an interesting history.
And so, do you remember Daniel's early contributions? Can you think of anything specific when he was at Sunstone that he helped, move along?
Well, yeah. I mean, first off, he was determined to create a very inclusive bridge building place, and he was looking for a certain type of editor who could bridge between, the critics and the conservatives, and so that was his first main thing. And then Daniel focused a lot on money and fundraising. Daniel really helped to take Sunstone out of a very shoestring kind of struggling operation. I don't know how Peggy did it. Peggy kept it going for 10 years, and she was always exhausted.
Yeah, in fact, when I spoke with Albert a couple days ago, and Albert, he has a great memory. He remembers the details of everything. Reminded me when Daniel came on, Sunstone was seriously in debt, and they were getting threats from the IRS. They were, and so these people would be calling saying, "Hey, we need our money," and Daniel would be like, "Okay, we owe you $10,000. Will you take $2,000 or whatever?" And he would just negotiate all this, and then he started a giant fundraising campaign, and that's how they got out of debt. Daniel got him out of debt, and also all the supporters of Sunstone really rallied, and they, expanded from there. It was pretty remarkable what they were able to do, and that's
Was there any theme to the fundraising thing, or is it just brute strength that making a bunch of calls?
He was doing mail campaign. They were doing mail campaigns, asking Sunstone people to donate, and people were very generous and would donate. There were a lot of really well-connected people that were attending Sunstone, and it just kind of took off.
And I mentioned some other thing in, just the Americana. At the same time, the National Lampoon magazine was sort of doing a similar thing. They were trying to do their own thing and grow and build. And other publications, I won't say Playboy or anything like that because that happened earlier. But there's lots of things that, were changing. And so as Daniel progressed and as he got on a balanced thing, Did the programs get stronger? Was there a noticeable strengthening of Sunstone's quality?
Well, Sunstone expanded. They started having, Maxine, maybe you remember when they started expanding the symposium. They had one in Washington. They had
that was 85. It was April of 85. They had the very first regional symposium. And it was, I remember I went and I took Avraham Gileadi with me. They wanted him to come out and speak, and he didn't want to go by himself. And I said, okay, I'll go with you. And because I was still working for BYU at that time, and I was working on Avraham's stuff. So yeah, I took Avraham out there. And at that time, the reason that they had a regional symposium was because Albert was living in DC, and he was this DC representative for Sunstone. So Albert organized the very first regional Sunstone.
Yeah, and they were able to get that up and running. And, they had a West Coast, they had an East Coast.
Yeah, and it was Albert working with Daniel. Daniel brought stability and more money and a broader base of support. And like Lisa said, it was a major transition because Peggy was such a devoted intellectual and editor.
Yes.
And she kept it going, but it was always on a shoestring and she was always starving. We did an interview with her, and it was at 7th East Press, and it was the woman behind Sunstone magazine. And it was titled "Always a Little Hungry." She just kept it going. She and Susan Staker, I really have to mention Susan Staker, who was her assistant editor there. The two of them were dynamite, but they kept it going. But yeah, Daniel transformed Sunstone. He brought in a new legitimacy, a new aim for a more mainstream approach, and money and support. And for the first time, it was really stable, so that then Albert could launch these regional symposia and make the reach bigger. Yeah,
Daniel was really good with people, and that was right in his wheelhouse.
He was amazing.
Yeah, the energy and the ideology to bring things to pass that maybe other people were a little more realistic about, but he had the dream. I feel like,
and Albert alluded to this, that both of them were very idealistic about it. And they both worked really hard.
Mm-hmm.
And it worked.
And their idealism and vision matched. Albert and Daniel had the same vision. They both wanted to be bridge builders. They both wanted to be inclusive.
Absolutely.
They both wanted to make it broader and more. They both wanted to see people talking to each other more. And they were a dynamic team. I mean, I did the right thing. I wound up working with Mike Flynn on his stuff and doing gender studies at the U of U. So I made the right decision, and Albert was the right person to be at Sunstone. But I continued by just presenting at Sunstone. But they were, they transformed Sunstone, and they did. It just became so much bigger and more stable. And just the reach, the regional symposia, and now they have symposia in England. Sunstone is so much bigger, but that was each stage of Sunstone played its crucial role. The founding stage with Scott Kenny and Alan Roberts and Peggy, that was crucial. They were all theology. They were all connected to GTU, the Theological Union at Berkeley. That's how they connected, and they wanted to create a theological symposium. They saw a need for a theological organization and focus.
Yeah.
And so that
nobody at church headquarters was doing theology.
Yeah. Yeah, except in the olden days when there used to actually be an organization for theology. But and so that phase was really important to launch the concept of a theological focus. And then after Alan and Scott moved on to Cooper Roberts and to Signature Books, Peggy and Susan kept it going, and Lori Winder helped a lot. She was involved. The three of them, I kind of saw them as my three feminist sisters or role models at that time. When I went up, Albert and I went up to Sunstone in 1981 to meet Peggy, because we were working on 7th East Press, and she was impressed with what we were doing, and she wanted to talk Albert into leaving 7th East Press and come work with her at Sunstone, which she eventually did. But we really, we all, I guess the point is we all were just jumping in and doing what we could on a shoestring, no support, no mechanism, we were inventing a new a new aspect of Mormon Studies in the 80s. We just had to jump in and do what we could without money and support and with a whole lot of opposition.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it's okay if I switch for just a minute. I wanted to say something about Daniel as a, person outside of all of this. He, who he really was this was one component of his life. And I think for him, his kids were very important. Unfortunately, he was taken far too soon, but he was a wonderful father. And so his death was a huge loss. It was a huge shock too. I was in shock for a couple weeks. I mean, I couldn't eat. I was not there. It was that, almost dissociative state I was in. But I think as a person, he was just a wonderful human. He had so many wonderful parts to him, and very rare person. I feel like I was so fortunate to be married to him, and I just wish so much that my kids had him longer, because when he died, I was just like, okay, I'm on my own here, and I really felt that. It was a huge, just gaping, and I was pretty traumatized by the whole thing. I think the whole church experience had been somewhat traumatizing, but I had Daniel, and we, it wasn't the only thing in our lives. We had other friends, we had activities, we had things we loved and did together. Children, the kids were just a huge part of that. My son started Nordic ski jumping. We were spending a lot of time doing that. We were hiking. He was supporting me. I started traveling around with a group of friends doing marathons, things that, he was super supportive of and that were so positive. So, but to lose Daniel for my children was, I think, the hardest thing.
That was awful.
Yeah. No one can replace a parent. No one can replace a father. You can replace a publisher and president of Sunstone. You can replace a lot of things, but you can't replace a father. And he's, that's a big gaping loss in our lives still today. So anyway, just I think that I wish I don't know if there is anything after this life, if he's there, if he can, but I don't, I just think it really was amazingly shocking, because he was so alive, the most alive person I ever knew and have ever known.
Yeah.
Like, he had boundless energy. So my daughter spoke at the funeral. I was in a daze, but there's one other story I want to tell you guys, because it's so interesting. So we're planning the funeral, and I was somewhat, I was kind of involved in that, but the night of the viewing, it was kind of like the GAs all came, and, our little families huddled over. I remember I said to my son, and he said, let's go. So we got in the car and we kind of drove off. We came back, and all the GAs are still doing their laughing and talking, and I'm just, that was the night, the viewing the night before. But the day of the funeral, as far as I knew, the program had a few of Daniel's friends speaking. My daughter, Sally, spoke. She gave a wonderful tribute. And then I guess my father-in-law was on the program. I was still not in a very presence. But Tom Monson.
You were muffled there for a little bit. Anyway, you were saying Tom Monson something?
Yeah, so I don't know what happened, but all of us, we're thinking we're done with the funeral. It's been long. We had Sally, we had Dan's friend Kiwi, gave a wonderful talk. We had his friend Stan Ricks, who, these are people he hiked with and biked with. And then we had Fred Voros. We had Dan's little brother, John, John's just a wonderful person who, really loved Daniel. And of all of, he was actually really supportive of Daniel. And he lived in Idaho, but wasn't, so he wasn't here that much. I wish he had been more. he and Daniel were quite close. Tom Monson shows up at the funeral, I guess, maybe, I don't know if he showed up on his own. We're at a stake center, which I wish we'd have been at Snowbird instead or something more appropriate. And the people who really loved Dan would have been. But all of a sudden, he gets up and off he goes on this speech. First thing he said was, "Lisa, you are a widow." And I have these, non-Mormon friends there in the audience, and my, ski jumping mom's friends and all kinds of people that weren't Mormon, and their audible gasp, like, whoa, did he just say that? But Tom just basically, it was extremely painful because I had hoped that Paul could talk about him. Paul knew and loved Daniel. I didn't want to really necessarily be at a stake center. These were decisions that were not in my control because of the whole way, it
was my dad. My dad made the decision.
However that went, but it was, I think. I don't know if my father-in-law invited Tom.
I'm sure he did.
You think so? I mean, I wondered if he just like, I'm the guy. So it was interesting because other people who were like, very Mormon were like, oh, Tom Monson's here. And they, it had nothing to do with Daniel. It was that whole idea that the church had about, well, at a funeral, we don't eulogize people. We're going to be about the gospel.
Plan of salvation talk.
Yeah, that was extremely painful. But then, we also had Amazing Grace. They sang, and very loud bagpipers at the end, which kind of like drowned out all the, So, but it was very Daniel in the sense that the irony of, oh yeah, this isn't really, can't even be about you, Daniel, even when you die. It's going to be about the church. So I don't know if you felt that way, Lila. It was hard.
Yeah, I didn't like, well, I don't want to say bad things about people that others might like, but I wasn't a fan of President or Tom Monson. He wasn't the prophet at that time.
I didn't even know him, and I'm not trying to say, oh, bad Monson, but
they were friends with. He was a friend of Dad's.
That's what it was. Hartman, so this wasn't about, I guess, it was one of those. Let's set the record straight. This is not going to be about Daniel at that point. And all of the wonderful things that have been said about Dan were just kind of like fading into the background because Tom Monson went on for probably an hour. It was way over. We were all just squirming in our seats. But I think, I would want to be charitable too, Lila. I mean, I think maybe your dad did invite him. That's real possibility.
I'm sure he did.
Very, very painful for our family that we couldn't have it be more about Daniel as a father, as a husband, as a friend, and Sunstone as well, rather than, this is about general authority.
Yeah, the son of a general authority.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Instead of having his own identity.
A lot of irony in that, though. Yeah, that was the way he lived his life in that,
Yeah.
So I have mixed feelings about it, I guess.
I was just going to say it was typical too, and I guess in some ways it still is, but that was right at the time, right after the 2000s. What year was it? Was it 2002 or 3?
Was it 2, Lisa? 2002.
It was 2002, September 2002.
Yeah, 9/11.
It's a rough month.
Or no, just after the year after that. Yeah, it was the Olympics year. But it was right at that time they were doing that. They were especially going to the funerals of anyone who had a general authority connection. And really, I remember it was kind of this new policy at the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s, to ensure that the priesthood leader over the funeral would make sure that the main message of the funeral was about salvation and resurrection and redemption. and that was supposed to be, I remember that being this kind of new policy that was kind of coming in, and they did that at Leonard Arrington's funeral also.
Yeah, and I felt that was kind of a cruel and unusual policy. I just
That's still the policy. That's still the way it is. If you're going to have it in the church, it's going to be a church meeting. It's not a funeral for a person. It's a church meeting.
Yeah. I just remember them announcing it around that time. It was the very end of the 90s or beginning of the 2000s when it was like this new policy. And I also remember it was devastating. It was almost like the Hartman bombings all over again. Those of us in Mormon Studies were devastated because it was such a horrific thing, and an innocent person dying in a completely pointless, horrific way. And I remember all of us just feeling so devastated, and it really felt like the horror, again comes back. And it was like, why we couldn't, there was no sense to be made of it at all. And I just remember feeling again that way, that trauma and shock of something so horrific and so pointless, like we couldn't fathom why it happened. And Fred, go ahead. And I even had friends at that point when Dan died. I was Gnostic clergy serving at Holy Cross Chapel. And I had friends who weren't Mormon, who were climbers, Dan was really well known and kind of famous in the climbing community in Utah. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Yeah.
I had friends who knew about it and were commenting, and they were just horrified. I mean, it rocked the climbing community too. Go ahead.
Well, Daniel wasn't doing anything that was outside of his, ability. And it's like Lila said, it's something he did all the time. And it's something that is regularly done. People hike that all the time. But it was a fluke. It was just a fluke. And that, the guy that was with him came over and he said, I've been with people, because he did at the time. I don't know. I've lost track of this guy, but a mountaineer. This guy was a hardcore mountaineer. And he'd lost people, in places like, I don't know, in the Himalayas or whatever before. And he said, it's always something really unusual that you don't prepare for. Like someone will walk out of a tent in a boulder fall, So, and that's really true. I think that Daniel was, in fact, one of his friends' a friend of his mom said to him that Daniel was the safety man. Daniel would be the first one to turn back if the backcountry, if they were skiing and it started to get dicey and he thought it was risky avalanche, because he had, he knew how to dig a pit and check for avalanche danger. Daniel would say, nope, I'm turning back, because that's something that sometimes people are like, oh, we'll be fine. And they're not, even though people who backcountry ski are trained in that. So Dan was not afraid, but he wasn't taking risks unnecessarily.
He wasn't a daredevil.
No, not really. No, I wouldn't call him a daredevil. No.
He just had a zest for life.
He did, and he was pretty confident, and he'd never been hurt. Like I said, if he was, you'd see him going down, and you might fall and pop back up. And, he was just a beautiful skier. He was very coordinated, So that whole thing was just such a bizarre, difficult, we couldn't wrap our minds around it. Yeah. You're right, Maxine.
Yeah. I mean, and his skill level, he was known among my climber friends as a world-class climber. His skill level was way up there.
Well, and he wasn't, he didn't really climb a lot. I remember there were some people that wanted him to climb more, and he said, I have a family. I don't need to take that risk. I remember him telling me this. He didn't get much into that, but what he was doing was just it's a scramble. And there's a lot of scree up there. Scree is just loose rock.
Yeah, rock.
And you are on a knife edge ridge. But for people who do that, I have an actual climber daughter, and she says it's not, it's just what people do all the time. that's not. So, I think he tripped. It was early. They were going, he did it a lot in the morning. So you're right. Enough said about that. But
well, we couldn't make sense out of it. We couldn't. And I remember talking to you not long after. I talked to, what's his name? My mind just went blank. The close friend, the attorney.
Paul?
No,
Fred.
the other one. Fred. Yeah. I talked to Fred a lot in the aftermath. We were all hurting so much. And Fred said that he was coming over to be with the kids. He wanted to help kind of fill in as like a neighborly influence.
Fred and Paul, both came over and read to my kids for a while after Daniel died. Yeah, they read to my younger kids. My two oldest were, grown at that point. But he would read to them, and so they decided they were going to continue with that for a little while, and they did.
Yeah.
I remember Fred talking about that feeling. I mean, in the loss, Paul and Daniel were very close, and Fred and Dan were close, and Albert and Dan were close, and we were all feeling such loss and at a loss of how to help, what to do. And I remember Fred saying that they were going over to want to fill in and be with the kids. That was important. I remember Fred saying, what can we do? What can we do in the face of this loss? And well, we can go and be with the kids, because their dad's gone.
Yeah, they needed it. And of course,
it was nice for everybody to pitch in and come in to help.
Well, what do you do? I mean, what do you do? And like you said, I still can't wrap my head around it. And
that was kind of my question, Lisa, because I haven't talked to you for a while. In fact, I think the last time I talked to you was not that long. It was probably a year or two after we talked, and we were talking about how could this happen and what does it mean, and is there meaning to be found, or is this, I remember that was kind of, I think, my last conversation I had with you, and I remember you talking about, some, a bit of, I don't know, a sense of just futility and loss, but also there was a sense of foreboding too. And I was just curious how you feel about it now. It's really interesting to hear all these years later.
Well, I became a therapist, a mental health therapist. So there's this, way in which it's not that I would say, oh, great, this was a good thing. But I think there was a lot of growth for me personally. I had to really, of course, I was very traumatized, and traumatized people don't always make the best. A long time to process this. So I got in. I think I was coping the best I could. But I think for me personally, it's made a huge difference in my life. Daniel, even in his death, was helping me in a way, not that I think he was like there as a puppeteer helping or doing anything like comforting my children or anything, but I think that just his example and who he was, and the fact that I was there, I had to go on. And the other thing that happened is that Daniel had some wonderful friends who really came. They helped me try to figure out how I'm going to get by. And they were there for us for a couple of years. They took us to Lake Powell. They took us, I remember, jeeping. So we had that. I didn't feel a lot of support. His parents had moved, and they were never much in my kids' lives, but I did feel a lot of support from a few of his friends. And then my friends, and I've had, just that goodness is still there in the universe, whatever that is. People, they're good people. And so, you go on, you rebuild your life, you never get over it, you get through it. And there's always growth. And I guess that's about as much silver lining or as you can do with it. I don't know. I know it's made me a little more empathic about things like this. It's made me a better therapist, I think, having gone through this.
Yeah.
Geez, I would have rather have Daniel here, of course, because especially for my children, I often wonder, what would it be like if you were here?
Yeah.
What would we be doing? And how would it be different? And of course, I can't know that. You know.
Right. So I guess in a way, I probably should wind this up. And thanks for your time. Like I said in the last episode, hearing about Daniel from Lila's story on Mormon Stories was impacted me a little bit, and I got to know about more things in Mormon history. And I thought there are probably lots of people who pass away early or who change careers or whatever that impacted some area of people's lives for a little while. And then they were gone and they might be forgotten in history. And I thought, well, since he was in Sunstone and I have grown to appreciate Sunstone, I went to my first Sunstone as a 63-year-old. And I thought, I would try to do something. It was been on my mind. And I remembered that Daniel participated in Sunstone, and that made me wonder about, maybe doing a show, talk to Lila about it. And so happy to be able to have this as the second part. Thank you for coming and expressing, more memories about Daniel. Is there anything else that somebody has to say before I close? Raise your hand, or otherwise I'll just thank everybody for watching. And so, because it's a show, want people to share this, with other people they think could use it, people that are interested in history. And, if you want to see more of a show like that we're producing, subscribe, like, and share. And so thanks a lot.
Did you want to say something, Maxine?
Oh, I was just going to say, I have wondered what Mormon Studies might be like if Daniel hadn't been taken. But maybe he would have moved on to other pursuits. But I just have wondered that.
Yeah.
But he was formative for the years he was with Sunstone, right?
Huge.
And so that we can
Big
all
change.
appreciate that. And I'm grateful for the friendship I have with Lila. Thanks for coming on our show, and we'll see everybody next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks for doing that, Jean.
Yeah, thank you.
I love you.
Love
Bye-bye.
you guys.
Love you guys.